All right. Welcome, everyone, friends and students, fellow teachers in training, near and far, to the Peaceful Solution Character Education Teacher Certification Training course. I'm glad that you are able to join us again. And in case there are anybody who is anybody who is joining us for the first time, welcome to the class. We hope that you will enjoy what you learn here this day. It's evening here in Texas, but I know it could be afternoon or early morning in different places throughout the world. But do welcome you all, everyone who does desire to improve their quality of living and add to their skills in interactions, communication, and just creating a better environment for themselves and others. This is the place for you. We are going to be picking up or continuing in where we left off last class. And in case you're just joining us, we are in unit number 3 of the 5 intermediate series units for the Peaceful Solution here, and this is the self-control unit. We are in chapter 3 of unit 3, and we're on the topic here of controlling your anger. Now, chapter 2 dealt with controlling your emotions to your advantage, understanding what emotions are, how emotions are triggered, how they can build you up, how they can tear you down, and so forth. And we kind of covered a broader spectrum of emotions in chapter 2. In chapter 3, we're dealing specifically, kind of targeting specifically anger, the emotion of anger, because as categorized as a negative emotion, it has caused many conflicts, hurt feelings, outbreaks, lashes, war, and so forth for thousands of years. And of course, we want to get people to understand what anger is. That's kind of the purpose of what we're covering here in this chapter. What anger is, right? The triggers, the cues, the sequences, and so forth, and how to respond, how to control yourself. How do we control ourselves when that emotion of anger, which, by the way, as it's been covered in previous classes, we know that it is not a primary emotion, it's a secondary emotion, right? There's an emotion that comes before anger that arises in a person's mind, or in a person's, heart. Well, the thoughts are also a huge contributing factor to those emotions kind of boiling up or bubbling up inside of us, all right? And so we want to get the student, the purpose of that is get them to be more conscientious, right? To be able to recognize when these feelings or cues start to spawn up inside of them, and to recognize them and to have a plan in place to deal with them appropriately. In other words, and deal with them in a way that doesn't bring harm to themselves, others, or the environment. Right? And that's what we were talking about in the previous class. We were talking about what I was covering was determining your anger style, all right? Because that's where William left off in showing the different styles of anger. That was on page 66 there. The different styles of anger, which is, the displacement, the withdrawal, and the attack, and how people can have a combination of them or a predominance of one or the other. And they also might have a mixture of an anger style and utilizing the right choice to solve a problem. But, the purpose in that self-evaluation that we covered in last class was to, for you as teachers to get your students to kind of see, how they respond to anger. What is the way that they deal with anger when they're faced with a difficult situation, right? And then also to give them some pointers, some tips on what they can put in place of that anger or that anger response. Okay, and that's the beneficial thing about the Peaceful Solution. It doesn't just tell you that you're doing something wrong or that something is negative. It gives you the vision, so to speak. It enlightens your mind so that now that you can see that something is right and something is wrong, you recognize when things are wrong, all right, as well as when things are right, but you recognize when things are wrong, and then you work to eliminate those negative things out of your life by replacing them, not just ignoring them, right? But by replacing them with the opposite, something positive, right? You have to, if a person has a tendency of having a short fuse, right? Now they've got to replace it. They have to recognize that first, that they have a short fuse, and then they have to work on replacing it with the character trait of patience, right? Long suffering and so forth. So we give the student, and that's what you as a teacher have to always remember. It's necessary at times to let your student know if you do see a problem, it needs to be pointed out gently and with, consideration for the person. But the ultimate goal should always be to redirect that pattern of behavior, that pattern of thinking towards a positive, right? Towards a positive concept, towards a positive principle and so forth, so that the student will, they won't be just left with an empty hole in their head because we yank the impatience or we yank the anger out of there, telling them that's bad, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that, but we didn't fill it with anything beneficial. Okay, so that's the important role of a teacher, right? We fail in our jobs if we just go around pointing the finger and telling people they're doing wrong all the time, but we don't give them the solution, right? That's a part of the teacher's job. The role is to, yes, recognize when things are wrong. If something does arise that is wrong, of course, acknowledge and admonish when things are well and the students make right choices, right? You should congratulate them and lift them up and so forth when they do recognize when they've done something and they make the right choice. Yeah, they should be honored for that, right? Because it takes a lot, as we as adults know, how much effort it takes when faced with a difficult situation, when faced with a moral choice, how difficult it is to choose the right thing. And like we covered in the first chapter of the character unit, developing, maintaining, and displaying these positive character traits, it's not the easiest thing to do, and it's considered to be the road less traveled. So when we point things out, also give a solution, right? And try to find more positive than you do negative. Otherwise, your students might think that you don't have anything great to say about them. All right, so we finished on page 67 last class, page 67. So I want to go back to the lesson plan here, LP3, lesson plan 3, page D. And we're finished. The last procedure we covered was procedure number 5. All right. So now we're going to go down to procedure number 6 and start reading there. It says, remind students that each person is responsible for controlling his or her anger. Okay, so now we're getting to see here in this portion of the lesson, we've recognized where anger comes from, how it's triggered, the sequences, cues, and all those things, different styles. Now we're going to help the students understand that it's not just something that they do and get away with. They're responsible. They have to be accountable for the things, how they handle themselves in these situations. And then you're going to have students turn to page 71 through 72 and read the section, you are responsible for controlling your anger. That's one of them. And start controlling your anger. That's the other one. Emphasize to students that they can control their anger by controlling the way they think. And we've mentioned it over and over, and we'll continue to mention it many times in future classes. Understanding and controlling your thought process is essential to developing, maintaining, and making decisions that are advantageous and beneficial for you in developing a positive character, right? You have to recognize, a student can't be a lazy thinker, right? They can't just cast their thoughts aside and just go by whatever or however they feel, or just in the heat of the moment. Okay, that's that impulsiveness that we covered in the previous classes, and it brings a lot of consequences with them. Okay, and young people don't think about these things. Sometimes older people don't think about them either. But we want to get them to grasp hold and be in control of their thought process. Now, like we've mentioned before, okay, can't control everything that enters into your mind, right? Speed of light. 186,000 miles per second, all these different thoughts are going in and out of a person's mind, and they might not really be focusing on many of those thoughts, But we want to get them to understand that when it comes to thoughts that affect their character, right? Thoughts that affect the decisions that they make, thoughts that affect how they interact with others, thoughts that affect how they're going to respond to an emotion. They have to be able to recognize it. They have to be willing to recognize it, okay? Because being able to and being willing are kind of two different concepts. You know, a lot of people are able to do things, but they're not willing to do them, okay? And so that's what we want to get them to do is be willing to, and of course be able. At the same time, people are willing to do things, but they don't have the knowledge, right? This is why knowledge is so, and education is so very beneficial, because a person could want to improve their character, but they don't have the knowledge and the skills, the tools, the resources to do so. So they need a combination of both things coming from within them. So they emphasize to students that they can control their anger by controlling the way they think. Tell students that it is easy when we are angry to focus on hot thoughts that fuel our anger. You know, hot thoughts that fuel our anger. I don't know if you've ever been camping before, you know, or possibly even had like a fire pit or something in the backyard in the fall or something of the year, or maybe possibly a nice cool summer night. And there's just something about, sitting around that campfire and just staring at the fire. It's almost like mesmerizing, looking at that fire. And it's just, now of course crackling fire, that can be very relaxing. Well, in regards to our thoughts, those hot thoughts, those hot thoughts, they can kind of like a fire, they can just draw your attention, and only thing you see is all these negative thoughts of retaliation, or I can't believe they did that, and so forth, all these negative hot thoughts that fuel your anger. They're so easy to focus on because they give you a sense of gratification, kind of like when a person takes vengeance on somebody else. They kind of feel relieved that they finally did that, or this person's been bullying me for X amount of years, and I finally was able to stand up for myself and beat them up, right? Anything that brings harm to someone, yourself, or the environment, those are all negative choices, of course, as we've covered before. But it's easy to focus. It's easy to focus on hot thoughts that fuel anger. By recognizing and then changing our anger style, we can learn to think cool thoughts that help us calm down and keep our feelings in perspective. And that's important. I think most of us, for the most part, have been in a situation where we are possibly you've worked all day and it's hot and you're sweaty and your clothes are sticking to you, and you can't wait to get out of the stinky clothes and kick off your hot shoes or boots or whatever, and then you cool down with a nice cool glass of water, or take a nice cool shower, or you sit by the fan and you're able to kind of relax and calm down and cool down. Well, that's the same thing that those cool thoughts do for you, right? They kind of relax you, they put you at ease, they calm you down, they get you to a place and a point in your mind where you can now reason, where you can now think clearly. Remember, we talked about how emotions can cloud your thoughts. It can cloud your thinking. It can cloud your judgment making, and thereby clouding your judgment making, clouding your decision making process. Okay? So we want to get the student to understand about their thoughts, and then how they can reverse those cool thoughts, those hot thoughts, to cool thoughts, because they still have to make decisions. They can't just throw all those things aside. They first have to calm down and then make a decision. And then lastly, it says, have students complete the exercise found on page 73. So let's go over to page 70. 70 is where we're going to pick up, because that's where we left off there, and then we'll get over to 71 here. And we see here just a little caption there, image. It says, bear this in mind. Don't let your anger control you like a puppet. control your anger. Don't let it control you. And I'm going to, just in case here, because I didn't make a slide for that. But if you can see that there, you know, you've got the example of the puppet controlling the person, right? And that's kind of the similar, or the example of anger controlling you. Instead, we must be the ones who control our own anger, right? You know, using it or responding to it with it in a positive way, okay? And as we're going to read here, we're going to, as we covered before, you know, it's just, anger just lets you know that there's something that you don't agree with, okay? And the bottom there section, it says, we have the ability to think, reason, and control our thoughts and actions. Therefore, we need to take responsibility for controlling our anger. And now we're going to get into responsibility, that responsibility that we're going to cover here. And we're going to look at page 71. For the first slide there, you are responsible for controlling your anger. All right, and you see the little guy there on the picture there. You know, he looks like he's about ready to break out in a rage there. You know, but that started in anger. But each person is responsible for controlling their anger. You know, and as we're going to read here, you're also responsible for controlling how you respond. Now, I want to just jump back real quick. We look at that term responsible because that's a positive character trait. And I just want you as teachers to remember in training your students, when we get to this title here, you are responsible for controlling your anger. Let's not forget that we are not just teaching people to control their anger, although they're going to get that out of this, but this is one piece of a puzzle, right, that is covering a wide array of things in character development. And one of the things is in developing positive, sound moral leaders, okay? And that's something that we want to keep in mind as we go through this. If you just write down for your notes, and this would be something that you could write for your notes as teachers over that word responsible, which is a positive character trait, in chapter 6, right, of the character unit. Let's see here, page 131.3, under Be a Positive Leader, it says, positive leaders are responsible for their actions. The characteristic of being responsible is a combination of following through on your task and being responsible for your actions. Now, one of the actions we're talking about here is how you respond to anger, okay? Because that's an action that comes forth from each and every person, whether it's positive or negative. It also includes not blaming others for your mistakes, but learning from them, right? Like the picture of the young guy, you know, you can't blame somebody, oh, he made me angry, or she made me angry, or whoever it was, you know, that bus didn't wait for me, so I got upset, you know, and I kicked the trash can and knocked it in the street, and the car swerved, and it caused a 3-car pileup, you know. You know, it's actions can lead to other actions that can be harmful to others. Let's see here, and then on page 17, under the character trait responsibility, it says, being responsible means to be accountable and answerable for your actions. You will be known as a reliable person, someone others can count on. Responsible people are given more duties because people know they can be counted on to do a job. They also receive more privileges. Remember this, basing your decision on facts, not emotions, and that's very important in developing this trait of responsibility. I think most of us have been in situations where we had a job to do and the thought came into our mind, I don't really feel like it. I don't feel like it today, right? That's a feeling, right? We can't base our decisions on how we feel. We have to base those decisions on facts. It's important to building a true moral character. When you gather all the facts, you are able to make a better decision than when you have only a portion of the facts. And that's just a part of being a responsible person. All right, so let's go back to page 71 in the self-control unit there. And then we see here that in the first paragraph, under you are responsible for controlling your anger. No one can make you angry, and no one can control your anger except you. Okay, so you can eliminate all the other factors around you, all the other people in your environment. It doesn't matter what they're doing. Sure, they might be disrespectful to you. All right, someone might ignore you for something, or you might get overlooked for something. Okay, it might be really loud in the house while you're trying to study and concentrate. You might just be having a bad day. But you, me, we are the only ones who can control our anger, right? Along with no one making us angry. In the same manner, you can choose to be angry. You can also choose to handle, and remember we covered in the last class that word handle is synonymous with manage, and we're going to cover that later in anger management. We have to manage our anger, but you can choose to handle anger in appropriate ways. You can choose to avoid causing harm to yourself and others. And if you look at the next slide there, as we look at this next sentence, it tells us there that controlling your anger means making a conscious choice. Now, a conscious choice, okay? And in that slide, you see that, that portion of that iceberg, right, that's above the water. That's kind of our conscious thinking. Those are the things, those are the thoughts that we, the portion of our mind that we're conscious, we're aware of, right? We're using it, we're taking information in, we're analyzing it, we're putting it out, we're making conscious decisions to do this or to do that or to not do this or to not do that and so forth, okay? But there's also the subconscious, and I just bring this up because we can't forget that, because what we consciously take into our minds and accept on a regular basis, eventually it makes its way down to that subconscious mind, and that information is stored in that subconscious. And eventually, as that becomes a part of you, because your subconscious mind does a lot of things that we are not consciously aware of. Our breathing, our respiration, that's breathing. Our blood pressure, our heartbeat, or, if we're sweating or not, all these things are controlled by the subconscious mind. Okay, but there are other things that you've heard people say, instinct, or it came naturally to me, or something like that, right? A lot of those things are based on training that has been done over a period of time to where it's been fed into the subconscious mind, and the subconscious mind has accepted it. And then when the trigger comes, the subconscious mind feeds that back to the conscious mind, that portion above the iceberg, and then that's the response that comes forth from the person. It's kind of like what we gave the example of, first responders, police officers, firemen, paramedics, and so forth. Their trigger might be a call, on the radio, or the sound of gunfire, or seeing a fire, or a person in danger, or something like that. Right away, their training kicks in, and it comes back to them consciously, right? And they go right into kind of autopilot mode, okay? And sometimes they are thinking about it, but they don't have to consciously think about what to do because it becomes automatic, kind of like driving, right? When you first start driving, you have to consciously, look this way, look that way, check your rearview mirror, turn on your turn signal, take your foot off the brake, put it on the accelerator. And if you're driving the manual, slowly bring it off the clutch, make sure your gear's in. You have to do a lot of things consciously, and then after a while, it all comes together automatically. You're still thinking about it, but your subconscious mind is doing it for you, okay? But anyway, when we do this, when we control our anger, it means that we're consciously, so we're paying attention too, right? We're not just letting things just come in and out of our minds. We're paying attention to our thoughts and our feelings, and we're making a conscious choice not to let our anger get the best of you. And if you look at slide number 3 there, that phrase, get the best of you. It's getting the best of someone. It's actually an idiom or a phrase, a saying, and it means getting the best of someone or something. It means to overwhelm, take control. Now, we're talking about having self-control. This is something that's taking control or gain an advantage over someone or something, okay? And what are we talking about? Not another person. We're talking about the emotion of anger. Not letting the negative emotion of anger take control where we're supposed to be in control. If we're not doing what we're supposed to and practicing self-control, then that emotion now has leeway to take control, take over, take advantage of us. And it could lead to, like we see here in this next sentence here, or not allowing it to turn to rage. And that next slide there, it shows here kind of what takes place, with rage. On slide 4 there, it shows that rage is actually a situation where anger is completely out of control. Completely out of control. And then you've got these men here who are actually trying to put, and we use this slide quite a bit in our workshops on dealing with disrespect, but these firemen are doing their best. Now you look at that hose there, and look how big that fire is. And I'm not saying they're not making a dent in it, but you think, have you ever tried to deal with someone who was fully enraged, right? It's difficult to talk to them. Very difficult to talk to them and calm them down, okay? And when they're in that situation or in that mindset or that emotion is so powerfully clouding their mind, they do a lot of things where they say, well, I just saw red, and then I kind of came to. Well, in the meantime, they've beat everybody up in the parking lot. They drove their car and crashed it through down a city street or whatever. And that's like blinding rage because you're not seeing what's taking place because you're so overwhelmed with that emotion. We don't ever want to allow it to get to that point, okay? And it says here, by being aware, and the next little slide there will show you there, being aware of your anger triggers, right? Being aware of your anger triggers, including your the things that could that triggers or something that kind of starts a process there. Being aware of your anger triggers, your thoughts, how somebody might do something or say something to you, right? And then you have these hot thoughts that follow, right? You have to be aware of these things because, of course, they can lead to this rage or they could lead to retaliation. You see some of the quotes around the little guy who is trying to be aware, right, of the things that could trigger your anger, and those are actually thoughts. I really should have put more triggers there. A trigger could be, something that sparks the emotion of fear. Trigger could be somebody yelling at you. A trigger could be somebody snatching something out of your hand, right? It could be a number of things that are a trigger, and that next slide kind of shows you how a trigger can start a process of things. Slide 6 there, it shows you how just like dominoes, a trigger can start and then it can just throw everything else off course if you're not careful, right? And I don't know if you've ever tried to stop a row of dominoes going down. You usually end up knocking the domino behind your hand that you're trying to stop, and it just keeps the problem going, okay? But unlike dominoes, we can stop ourselves, right? We can control our emotions, get a hold of them, and bring ourselves under subjection, right, to positive concepts, positive principles, moral principles, and so forth, so that we can think clearly to make decisions, positive decisions. And so it says, by being aware of your anger triggers and anger style, you can take steps that will lead you to making positive choices even when you feel angry. All right. And so this, to me, this ties into like what I mentioned before about responsibility and responsible leaders taking steps. Now notice here it says you can take steps that will lead you. So the student is consciously putting forth the effort to take steps that will lead themselves. So this is a little bit of self-leadership that we're seeing here, right? A person has to be able to lead themselves in the decision-making process, right? The teacher, the parent, the counselor, they can't be there all the time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with the student, okay? They have to be able to take these concepts themselves and start to put them to work in their lives, which might mean thinking about them a little bit when the class is not going on, going over them, rereading the information from time to time. Instead of going on Facebook and just scrolling a whole bunch of random nothingness, go back and rewatch a class, right? Go back and even look at some of the quotes on the Peaceful Solution, which are taken right out of the Peaceful Solution books. These are things that are reminders. You can even take some of these quotes that are in the Peaceful Solution and type them up and put put them in a little picture frame or something and hang them on the wall. And they're wonderful reminders on your mirror in the morning. Most people look at the mirror before they leave. Check your hair and your makeup or whatever it is. Put that in your mind. Put those positive thoughts, those positive concepts, positive principles, reminder of the morals in your mind. Remind yourself of these things so that, like that iceberg, you're consciously being aware of what you're wanting to do, right? And you're associating it with making positive choices and the positive emotions, and eventually it's going to drive it deeper and it's going to have a firm root in your subconscious mind, and over time it'll be what you use to respond to problems with, okay? These peaceful solution concepts. All right, so it says there, a cold hard fact. Anger is a part of life. There will always be situations that will trigger your anger. That's true, and the reason being, part of the reason being, is that not everybody's training to practice to learn the peaceful solution right now. And in all honesty, even if they were practicing to learn the peaceful solution, you'd still have situations that'll trigger your anger, okay? Because you deal with different personalities, you deal with different, characters, you deal with different levels of growth and so forth. And there are going to be different scenarios and situations, how you feel, at certain times, if you're sick, if your stomach hurts, if you got a headache, a lot of different variables that could lead to the triggering of your anger, okay? Even when people's blood sugar gets low because they haven't eaten in a long period of time, it could affect their emotions more, and they become a little bit more emotional than they are when they, have proper balance of their the blood sugar and so forth. And then underneath their box it says, look at the bright side. You can control your response to any situation life throws your way. Each and every one of us can. We have the ability, once you learn this, everybody has the ability, because humans have a mind, unless there's, a defect or something like that prevents it from making certain decisions. But for the most part, we all have a mind that can choose to or choose not to do something, okay? We have to couple that with knowledge. Once a person has knowledge and they're able to recognize right from wrong and know how to apply these concepts, in any given situation, then the outcome is going to be peace. That is, if they choose the right thing. So let's look over to page 72 here. So we talked about being responsible for your anger. No one makes you angry. Just the same fact, like we covered here. No one can control your anger except for you. And just as you can choose to be angry, you can choose not to be. So let's look on page 72 here, and then we see start controlling your anger. So a person has anger, everybody does from time to time. Some people might have it a little bit more than others. They have different anger styles. They can recognize different cues and so forth. They're responsible for it. Acknowledging that, right? It's nobody else's fault. Each and every one of us are responsible for our very own anger. Now we've got to start controlling it, okay? Because until a person gets their anger, gets their emotions under control, then they're no different than somebody else who just goes with the flow, goes with how they feel, right? So on page 72 it says, by changing your concept of anger. Now, that word concept there, if you look at the slide here for the definition of this word concept, it says a concept is something conceived in the mind. Okay, so we're dealing with in the mind, how you see something. Thought or notion, a mental grouping of similar things, events, and people that is used to remember and understand what things are, what they mean, and what categories or groups they belong to. All right, so like the concept of negative emotions, right? You know that negative emotions fall into a particular category. One of the things that you can associate negative emotions with is how they make you feel, right? Well, before negative emotions, we can, we have a concept of our thoughts. Our thoughts, are they negative? Because if they are, more than likely, they're going to lead to negative emotions. Negative thoughts don't usually lead to positive emotions, right? On the flip side, you've got positive thoughts and positive emotions. But changing the way we see, anger. When we're able to do that, you can change the way you behave and act when you're angry, right? So, in other words, a person has to change the way that they see anger by not saying anger is a reason. Anger is a justification. Anger is an excuse for me to do this, this, and that. Okay, because when they look at anger in that way and they feel angry, then they think because they're angry, they can go ahead and behave in this way. All right, and that's not acceptable. And that's not true. Because they can be angry and recognize, hey, this is just, I'm feeling this way right now because there's something taking place that I do not like. I do not agree with. Possibly they know what it is already. If not, then they need to examine themselves and kind of evaluate, well, why is it that I'm feeling this way, right? Is it someone? Is it something that someone did to me? Is it something I heard? Is it something I feel? Is it something that triggered, a thought in my mind that has absolutely nothing to do with this current situation or environment that I'm in, but it triggered a thought from something that occurred years ago. A recessive memory or something like that. Somebody might smell the smell of burning rubber and not even take into consideration they got angry because, well, it was that smell of burning rubber that they remember because somebody was burning rubber in their neighborhood one time and, end up losing control of their car and then driving into their house or hitting a family member or a friend or something like that, right? So it could be something completely disconnected to the current event. But you can change the way you behave and act when you are angry. By now, you have grown accustomed to responding to what triggers your anger by reacting in a certain way, as we covered in the previous pages, which is, in effect, your anger style. Hence, you respond to anger by either giving someone the silent treatment, internalizing your anger, cursing, lashing out, retaliation, or a combination of all these. All of these. Remember, or however, you can change your concept of anger by accepting that you do not have to respond with these behaviors when you are angry. So you see here, by changing your concept, so now here all the way at the very bottom of this sentence, you can change your concept, and this is how it can be done. By accepting that you do not have to respond with these behaviors when you are angry. Okay? So if your students are wondering, well, what do I need to do to change my concept? Well, it's provided right here in the book. You don't even have to guess at it. Just go a little further down. Well, some common misconceptions about anger here. Anger is an excuse to become physically or verbally aggressive. All right? In other words, what we're covering here is common misconceptions or common concepts, but they're wrong concepts, right? They're misconcepts. They're misconceptions. They're the wrong conceptions that we should have concerning anger. And a lot of people think this because that's what a lot of people were taught. That's what they were trained. That's what they saw on the television or the cartoons or the video games or the movies, right? They saw that when a person, what did the green guy that gets big, you know, because he had some science experiment go wrong, you know, don't make me angry. You won't like me when I'm angry, you know, and the muscles grow and the shirts get ripped. That guy goes through a lot of clothes. I'm telling you, if he came to one of these these classes, he would never go through another pair of clothes like that, you know, wouldn't turn green either. But that's the idea. That's the concept that's put into people's mind, you know, get them angry. You know, even before people, I've seen people fight before, right? And they've gone into fights, and they do it in boxing too. You know, the coach or whatever, they'll slap them in the face, and they'll try to get them, get them angry and everything. So they can feed off of that negative emotion of anger before they go and try to bash the guy's head in. But this is not an excuse. Anger is an excuse. This is, remember, misconceptions. Anger is an excuse to become physically or verbally aggressive. Well, that's a misconception. It's not. Another misconception is anger is a reason to withdraw and isolate yourself from those who care about you. And as we're going to see when we get into these hot thoughts and cool thoughts, when people, they kind of go into themselves and they internalize these negative emotions and feed these negative emotions, then that leads to a lot of other mental issues like depression and anxiety and increased fears, lack of trust for other people, and so forth. And a lot of suicides come as a result of this because people don't seek help. They internalize these negative emotions and they don't deal with them in an appropriate way. And without the right tools, there's only so many options that people look to. Another misconception is anger is a reason to hurt yourself. No, it's not. Okay? Just like being disrespected is not a reason to hurt yourself. Being bullied is not a reason to hurt yourself. Being sad or depressed, that's not a reason to hurt yourself. Every single one of your students have value. Even if they don't see the value in themselves, they have value and they're special. They might not realize it, and it might be coming from you, the teacher, who was the first person that ever told them that, but they do have value. They are important. It's our job to try to help them to see that value within themselves and within the world around them. There's so many things people, if they get into these pits of negative thinking, this consistent negative thinking, then it's like they cannot see anything beautiful, right? Everything is down, it's rainy, it's gloomy, and so forth. So when they see and they look at the world around them, their concept of the world, it's with, cloudy glasses, right? Miserable, cloudy, black and white only glasses, okay? But there's never a reason to hurt yourself. And another misconception, the last one here is, anger is a reason to hold a grudge or seek to get even. And like the expression says that we'll cover eventually, holding a grudge is like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die. It never really works out too well. And And if you look at that box there, that box underneath there, and it's got a slide number 8 there for it. It says, anger simply tells you that something is being said or done that you do not agree with. All right? And as a note there for us teachers, although anger is a negative emotion, and we have to kind of remind our students about these things. Just because it's a negative emotion doesn't mean it doesn't mean that you have to respond negatively when it arises. Okay, we still have to be in full control of how we think, feel, and act. All right. So then underneath that box there, it says, to control your anger, you must first realize that anger is your internal cue. Now, you remember we covered the cues there in the previous page. I believe that was 65 there. Is on page 65. But it's your internal cue, how you're feeling. You know, the sweaty palms, the increased heart rate, and so forth. It's your internal cue that there is a problem that you need to solve by using your self-control. Not, I'm going to solve that problem by controlling how hard I hit this guy or how hard I hit that girl. No, it's using, remember, negative options are negative things are never an option. I hate to use that word option when we're saying they're not options, you know. Those choices, negative choices, are never the options that we should select. So you have to solve a problem by using your self-control. Now that you know what triggers your anger, when faced with one of these triggers, stop. And this takes us all the way back to the STOP acronym, STOP. Stop, think, options, and proceed, as we've held up the sign so many times there. So here's a solution. Here's something that the student can do. And as a teacher, you can use this as an exercise with your class, kind of have them stand up. They've been sitting down, you know, stretch out a little bit, you know, let them kind of wiggle their legs and stretch their legs out, and then kind of go through this with them. You know, take a deep breath, you know, and sometimes that does help, you know, just stopping and sometimes it just feels great just to be able to take a deep breath. And there are things, physiological changes that take place in your body when you take a deep breath and then when you exhale. Okay, and if you have time, it would be great to look at the physiological changes that do take place. Breathing is very important. I mean, of course it is to stay alive, but even in calming yourself down and kind of collecting your thoughts, relaxing yourself, kind of clearing your mind, you know, breathing is very, very essential. And not just breathing, but being mindful and kind of controlling your breathing. Okay, because when you get angry, you're usually, you know, sometimes your heart rate, your breathing rate, everything's preparing for some type of strenuous activity to take place. So take a deep breath and count slowly to 10, 20, or 30. Keep counting for as long as it takes for you to calm down. And that's something you can give to your students to do. Now, at first, they might make it to like 5,000. I don't know. You know, because they have a, as they call it, a short fuse. They're easily angered, a short anger fuse, and they get angry quite a bit. But I guarantee you, the more and this is the purpose, kind of getting them to recognize and pay attention to themselves, to see, to have a healthy self-concept of themselves, but to have a healthy concept regarding anger, changing their concept about anger. Remember, accepting that you do not have to respond with behaviors, these negative behaviors, when you are angry. So now they're consciously paying attention to what's going on in their mind and in their heart with their emotions. So they stop, you know, they take a deep breath, they count, they keep counting for as long as it takes for them to calm down. Because look, you know, our minds are extremely complex. And I know that we can multitask and do a lot of things. But most of the time, consciously, when we have to focus on one thing, we're focusing on that one thing. So we take breathing for granted. When we have to slow down and take a deep breath and count at the same time, for some people, that's like chewing bubble gum and walking, right? It takes a lot of energy to focus on breathing being mindful and controlling your breathing and counting. You know what? When they're doing that, they're not thinking about the thing that's causing the bringing about the emotion of anger. Okay? They're not thinking about that. They're not thinking about that person. They're not thinking about the situation. They're thinking about calming themselves down. And then when they are calm, as you see here, if your anger style is to attack, you must be extremely careful that you do not react impulsively and verbally or physically lash out at others. Stopping at this point in the anger sequence will help you avoid acting on your emotions. And when the person is calm, then they're able to think a little bit more clearly of the right options, the positive choices, and how to deal with it. First and foremost, they have to look at how do they need to deal with themselves. Because irregardless of what's taking place, they can't do anything to change the other person. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. They only have control of themselves. We only have control of ourselves. So that's why it's important to really get the student to, like I said before, realize the value in themselves. And all of what we're going over from character up to where we are in self-control, and the students taking these things unto themselves and practicing them and reading them and so forth and thinking about them and responding with these positive character traits, they're actually increasing their value. They're increasing their worth, both for themselves and society around them, because they're increasing their ability to contribute to society in a way that's going to be a positive example to society, that's going to bring about a positive ripple effect because of their respectful, self-controlled, positive communication and interactions with others and the environment around them. And that's very important. So let's look at page 73 there. Yeah, we've got some time. Page 73. And we're going to look at this next slide here, because we're going to be talking about hot thoughts and cool thoughts, right? And you look at that slide there, and we see you can look at those hot thoughts, right? And you kind of think about this. Sometimes if you associate something with a picture, it kind of makes it easier to remember. But when you think about those hot thoughts and the results that can come from those hot thoughts, look at that nuclear explosion there, right? You think about, I think 1945 was the time when Hiroshima and Nagasaki took place, but I can guarantee you that explosion did not take place, those two explosions did not take place, those were atomic bombs, because the people who dropped the bombs were thinking cool thoughts. I guarantee you, okay? So when you think about these hot thoughts, take into consideration that all those little hot thoughts over a period of time can lead up to that type of destruction. Because that bomb is the result of the works of man's hands. Okay? Something that we as a society have created to not solve a problem. Well, in their mind, it's solving the problem, without proper training. But destroying our fellow human being does not solve problems. War does never bring peace. Never has, never will. And then you look at that cool thoughts picture there, and that's, for different people, it could be a different scenery, but you look at how calm and peaceful and tranquil that, the nice body of water is, and the trees, and the nice blue sunny sky, and the few clouds in the sky. You can just kind of think about the babbling brook in the background and how it feels in the nice, cool, gentle breeze, and how just relaxed and peaceful and calm that would make you feel, as opposed to that other one that brings about destruction. Right? These are what our thoughts can bring. And yeah, even those type of thoughts can bring about a change in our environment. Why? Because it'll bring about a change in the way that people think, and as a result, a change in the way that people behave. But right here at the top of the page on 73, it says, change the way you think by concentrating, which means we have to conscientiously think about our thoughts. Think about your thoughts. Examine your thoughts. Focus on your thoughts. Instead, concentrating on cool thoughts instead of hot thoughts. Remember, hot thoughts fuel your anger, all right? They lead to violent and aggressive behavior. Cool thoughts will help you keep your anger in control. They will help you avoid impulsive behavior and will enable you to deal appropriately with whatever triggered your anger, whatever it is, those cool thoughts. And this is why, like I mentioned in the previous class, going over this information on a regular basis and preparing yourself in advance, right? Setting your mind in advance, as we covered, will help you to be ready to deal with any situation that comes your way. We can't, guesstimate on everything. We can't figure on every single scenario that we might encounter throughout the day, the week, the month, or the year. But we can prepare our mind on how we're going to respond. Because I can pretty much guarantee you, and anything that comes up, one of those concepts that we've learned or we are learning in the peaceful solution can be used to solve that problem. Or even better yet, prevent the problem from arising to begin with, if possible. So we're going to look at the bottom here. It says, using the example below as a guide, fill in the blanks with possible cool thoughts. Okay, and so for your students, this would be a great, well, they have the student's handbook, but if you didn't have a student's handbook, you can make a copy. Well, you can't really make a copy of this. This has the answers, but as a teacher, if you were teaching a class, it would be advantageous for you to have at least one student's handbook that you can make copies out of it, so that you can pass these out to your students and they can go over it. But if they had a handbook, they would have these hot thoughts on the left-hand side and just be blank for the cool thoughts so that they can fill it in themselves. And of course, these cool thoughts are just examples that a student might come up with just to kind of set the stage, so to speak. So we have here the first one here, an example is as a hot thought, I hate when people do this to me. Well, a cool thought would be, this is making me upset, but I can handle it, right? If a person thinks they can handle it, then that shows that they're in control. In other words, they can manage it. They can manage themselves in dealing with the situation. A hot thought number 2 there would be, this is so unfair. The cool thought would be, I can agree to disagree. Okay? Sometimes when people think something's not fair, it has to be their particular way. But the other party might be right too. It's just another way of doing something. Number 3 is, nobody ever sees my side. That's a hot thought. Cool thought would be, I can choose not to be angry. The 4th one there, somebody needs to slap some sense into him. Well, cool thought would be, I'm not going to make this into a big deal. Okay? Next one, everybody else is doing it. They're going to think I'm weird. In other words, if they don't do it. Well, cool thought would be, I'll maintain my true values. I don't have to do what everybody else is doing. Okay? And of course, like I said, these are just examples. Most students won't think like this to some degree, but they might, think or write down, just because everybody else is doing it doesn't mean it's right? They might give an answer like that, and that would be on the right page, right? Or, what I've learned in the peaceful solution is I should get the facts. Just because they're doing it, it might be something that could be harmful. I should learn a little more about it before I do it myself. So they could come up with, 100 different answers to any of these for the cool thoughts. Next one is, this isn't over, not by a long shot. He had better watch his back. And the cool thought, of course, would be, just as long as I keep my cool, I'm in control. And that's what we have to be, is in control. Right now, I'm so mad right now, I don't care about anything anymore. Cool thought, getting mad isn't going to help. And lastly, I hate myself, I'm so stupid. Cool thought, just because I make a mistake doesn't mean I should hate myself. I must aim for my very best every time. And over a period of time, students will eventually, they'll eventually develop this concept of thinking and responding to these hot thoughts with cool thoughts. It's not going to be automatic at first. It's something that they have to retrain their minds in, because in society and in the environment that most people have grown up in, especially in dealing with dysfunctional families and so forth, and coming from certain neighborhoods where violence is commonplace, they're going to have to put a lot of effort in changing their way of thinking from hot thoughts to cool thoughts, and recognizing hot thoughts and what they can lead to, and redirecting their thought process and their emotions, of course, that will follow, to cool thoughts, so that their behavior will be peaceful. Well, we're going to stop there on page 73, and we'll pick up on 74 next class, and David will be the teacher for next class, which is going to be 4/24. That's going to be this upcoming Sunday, 4/24 at 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. I do thank every one of you for taking the time to join us for class, and we look forward to seeing you next class. Have a wonderful day.